The two Black Hawk helicopters appeared over Ridgecrest Valley Hospital at 4:47 in the morning, and nobody on the night shift understood what that meant until it was too late to pretend they hadn't already failed. They weren't medevac. They weren't transport. They had no markings that meant anything to a civilian, and they came in low and fast with their running lights off, which meant someone very far up the chain of command had made a decision that couldn't wait for sunrise. Inside the hospital, a woman with burn scars running from her jaw to her collarbone was mopping a hallway outside the emergency department, because that was what the charge nurse had told her to do after stripping her of her patient assignment 40 minutes into her very first shift. Her name was Evelyn Marsh. She had been called worse things than incompetent in her life. She kept mopping. She watched the helicopters bank hard over the parking structure and said nothing to anyone. That was the moment everything began to unravel. Before the helicopters, before any of it, there had been the locker room. Evelyn had arrived 45 minutes early, which was habit. She'd found her locker, changed into her scrubs, and was reviewing her patient assignment sheet when two nurses walked in behind her. She heard them pause. She didn't turn around. "That's her," one of them said, quiet enough to be deniable. "The new one." "Where'd she even come from? HR won't tell anybody." "Does it matter? Look at her neck." Evelyn finished reading the assignment sheet. 4 patients, all stable, all routine. She folded the paper and put it in her breast pocket. The taller of the two nurses, a woman whose badge read Sandra Kowalczyk, RN, charge, moved to the mirror and began adjusting her ponytail. She made eye contact with Evelyn in the reflection. "You worked acute care before?" "Yes." "Where?" "Various places." Sandra's mouth thinned. "Various places." "Great. That's helpful." She turned around fully. "Look, I don't know what you put on your application, but this is a level 2 trauma center. We run fast here. If you can't keep up, I need to know that now rather than at 3 in the morning when someone's coding." "Understood. Do you have trauma experience specifically?" "Yes." "What kind?" Evelyn looked at her steadily. "The kind that matters." Sandra stared at her for a moment, then turned back to the mirror. "Donna, put her on East Wing. Stable overflow. Let's see how she does with the easy stuff first." The other nurse, Donna Fretwell, had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. She gave Evelyn a tight smile. "It's just how we do new orientees here. Nothing personal." Evelyn nodded once and walked out. The East Wing patients were exactly what Sandra had promised. Stable, post-surgical, waiting for discharge in the morning. Evelyn moved through them efficiently, checking vitals, updating charts, adjusting a confused elderly man's call light so he could actually reach it. By 11:30, she had completed every task on her assignment sheet and started on secondary documentation. The unit secretary, a young man named Trayvon, who couldn't have been more than 23, watched her from behind his station with open curiosity. "You're fast," he said. "I've done this a while." "Where'd you work before Ridgecrest?" Evelyn typed a note without looking up. "Here and there?" Trayvon leaned on the counter. "Sandra's going to check your references, you know. She checks everybody's." "She's welcome to." "She's not going to find anything, is she?" Evelyn stopped typing. She looked at him. He had an honest face, the kind that hadn't learned to hide things yet, and he was watching her with something that wasn't suspicion, more like fascination, like he'd spotted something and couldn't decide if he was right. "She'll find what she needs to find," Evelyn said. Trayvon nodded slowly, like that answered something, and went back to his work. At 12:40, Sandra came to pull her assignment. She didn't explain it, just handed Evelyn a task list. Restock supply rooms, verify crash cart seals on floors 3 and 4, mop the corridor outside the ED because maintenance was short-staffed. Evelyn looked at the list. She looked at Sandra. Sandra's expression said she was waiting for an argument, almost hoping for one. Evelyn took the list. She was mopping outside the ED at 4:47 when the helicopters came in. She heard the rotors before she saw anything, a sound she recognized in her body before her mind had finished processing it, a specific pitch and rhythm that her nervous system cataloged without her permission. She set the mop against the wall and walked to the ambulance bay doors and looked up through the glass panel overhead. 2 aircraft, no lights, banking hard. Military, not National Guard. The configuration was wrong for Guardbirds, the approach was wrong. Everything about the way they moved said these pilots flew in places that didn't appear on public maps. The ED doors burst open behind her. A paramedic she didn't know jogged past. "What's that?" he said, looking up. "Inbound trauma," Evelyn said. "From what?" "There's nothing on the scanner." "Military channel. They wouldn't be on yours." He looked at her, then back at the sky. "How do you know that?" She didn't answer. The radio at the ambulance bay crackled. A voice came through, clipped and precise, reading off a patient status that used terminology Evelyn hadn't heard spoken aloud in 9 years. She felt something cold move through her chest. She turned and walked fast back to the ED entrance, pushed through, and went directly to the charge desk. Sandra was already on the phone, her face the particular pale color of someone receiving information they hadn't been trained to receive. She looked up when Evelyn appeared. "I need to go back on the floor," Evelyn said. "You're not on the floor right now." "I know. I need to be." She held Sandra's gaze. "Trust me." Sandra's jaw tightened. "You don't have—" The ambulance bay doors exploded open. 2 Army medics in full kit came through at a jog, one on each side of a gurney moving faster than gurneys were supposed to move. On it was a man in shredded tactical gear, his face gray-white, a field dressing on his neck already soaked through. Behind the gurney, a 3rd soldier held a leash. At the end of the leash was a Belgian Malinois with a laceration across its left shoulder and its teeth showing at everything in the room. The ED team converged. Dr. Marcus Holt, the attending on shift, met the gurney halfway and began calling out orders in the organized chaos that emergency physicians practiced until it became reflex. Nurses moved in. Equipment appeared. Evelyn stood at the edge of the corridor and watched. She watched Holt's hands. She watched the field dressings. She watched the patient's chest rise and fall. The timing of it, the depth, the way his jaw was positioned. She counted seconds. At 17 seconds, she walked to the supply alcove beside Trauma Bay 1, opened a cabinet, and began pulling specific items. No one noticed. They were all focused on the main event. "Pressure's dropping," someone said. "He needs 2 large-bore IVs. Already on it. Somebody get me a second set of hands." Evelyn moved past a nurse at the doorway of Trauma Bay 1, not pushing, just finding the gap that existed and moving through it. She placed the items she'd pulled on the tray table beside the gurney. Holt glanced at her. "Who are you?" "Nurse Marsh, East Wing." "East Wing doesn't—" "His airway is compromised," Evelyn said, and something in her voice, the absolute flatness of it, the certainty, made Holt stop mid-sentence. She pointed at the angle of the patient's jaw, the subtle retraction at his throat. "There's an obstruction, partial. It's why his O2 sats aren't responding to the supplemental." Holt looked at the patient. He looked at the monitor. He looked back at Evelyn. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." 2 seconds passed. "Show me." She worked fast, the way she'd been trained to work, which was the way people worked when there were no second chances and no backup coming, and the only thing between a human being and the end was whatever was in your hands right now. She identified the obstruction, a fragment, small but positioned exactly wrong, and cleared it with a technique that one of the Army medics in the doorway recognized, because she heard him say something quietly in Spanish to the soldier beside him. The patient's oxygen saturation began climbing almost immediately. The room didn't go silent exactly, but it changed. The quality of the noise changed. People were still moving, still working, but there was a different frequency to it now, a recalibration. Holt was staring at her. "Where did you learn that approach?" "Practice," she said. "That's a field adaptation. That's not in any civilian protocol I've ever—" "His pressure's still dropping," Evelyn said. She had already moved on, was already looking at the IV lines, the fluid rate, the way the second field dressing was holding. "He's got a secondary bleed somewhere, abdominal, I think, based on how the original injury presented. He needs imaging, but you can't wait for imaging. You need to treat the presumption." Holt was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was a long time in a trauma bay. Then, "Somebody call surgery, tell them we're coming up." The controlled chaos reorganized itself. Someone called surgery. Someone adjusted the fluid rate. Someone did the things that needed to be done. In the corner, the Belgian Malinois made a sound. Not a bark. Not a growl. Something lower, more internal, directed at the room in general. The soldier handling it said something in a low voice. The dog didn't settle. Evelyn finished adjusting the secondary IV line and took a small step back from the gurney. The dog turned its head. It looked directly at her. It stopped making sound. The handler noticed. His hand tightened on the leash. "Ranger," he said softly, the word not quite a command, a question. The dog sat. Everyone who was watching saw it. Several people who weren't watching still somehow registered the shift. Evelyn leaned very slightly forward and said two words, barely above a breath, in a cadence that didn't belong in any hospital in Colorado. She said it the way someone says a thing they learned so long ago it's stored in a different part of the brain than language, in muscle, in bone. Ranger lowered his head. His whole body dropped its tension the way a fist opens. The handler was staring at her. His name tape said Devereaux, and his eyes had the particular look of someone doing rapid, involuntary arithmetic. "Ma'am," he said. "What did you just say to him?" Evelyn picked up the patient's chart and began updating the documentation. "I said he was going to be okay." "That's not—" Devereaux stopped. He looked at Ranger, who was sitting calmly now, watching Evelyn with focused attention. "That's not what you said." She kept writing. "Ma'am." His voice had changed. The deference in it was different now, not the deference of a soldier to a civilian medical professional, but something older and more specific. "Where did you serve?" The trauma bay had gotten very quiet again. Holt was looking at her. Sandra, who had appeared in the doorway at some point, was looking at her. 3 nurses, 2 medics, and a respiratory tech were all doing some version of looking at her while pretending to do other things. Evelyn finished her documentation, capped her pen, and set the chart down. She looked at Devereaux. "Get him to surgery," she said. "He can answer your questions when he wakes up." She walked out of the trauma bay before anyone could stop her. The hallway outside was quieter. She walked to the supply alcove, started replacing what she'd taken on a calculation that she wouldn't explain if asked, and became aware after 30 seconds that she wasn't alone. She turned. Trayvon was standing in the corridor, his lanyard twisted in both hands, watching her with that same expression from earlier, that honest fascination. "I saw that," he said. "Saw what?" "All of it. The dog, the airway thing. I was standing in the door." Evelyn continued restocking. "I did my job. Donna told Sandra you're not credentialed for trauma interventions, that Sandra's going to make a formal complaint to HR in the morning." Evelyn said nothing. "Is that going to be a problem?" She thought about what she could say to him. He was 23 and he had an honest face and he'd done nothing wrong. "I don't know yet," she said. It was the most truthful answer she had. He nodded. He stood there another moment. "The dog thing, though," he said. "That was— What was that?" "Dogs recognize calm," Evelyn said. "In high-stress environments, they read people. He was agitated because everyone in that room was agitated. I wasn't." "You said something to him." "I said he'd be okay." Trayvon looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were smarter than his age. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, sure." He went back to his station. Evelyn stood in the supply alcove for a moment after he left, her hands resting on a shelf of saline bags, and breathed. The helicopters had gone. The trauma bay was probably half cleared out by now. The patient headed upstairs, the military escorts figuring out their chain of notification protocol. In a few hours, Sandra would be at HR's door with whatever she'd managed to compile about a new nurse, whose references were technically impeccable and practically opaque. In a few more hours, it would be morning, and morning would bring its own complications. She had known that coming here was a risk. She had run the calculation and decided the risk was acceptable. That calculation had not accounted for a combat-wounded special operations soldier arriving at exactly this facility on exactly this night with exactly this dog. There was no reasonable way to account for that. She pushed off the shelf and went back to finish her shift. At 6:15, as the sky outside the ambulance bay began doing the thing it did in the mountains before actual sunrise, a specific gray-purple that had no equivalent anywhere she'd lived on the eastern seaboard, Sandra found her in the medication room. "I need your badge," Sandra said. Evelyn looked up from the medication reconciliation she was completing. "HR is opening a formal review," Sandra said. "Your credentialing documentation has irregularities. Until it's resolved, you're not authorized to practice." "I understand. I'm going to need you to understand that I'm not doing this to be difficult. I'm doing it because this is a credentialing issue and we have protocols." "You're doing it because it's your job," Evelyn said. "And because you don't know who I am, and that makes you uncomfortable." Sandra stiffened. That has nothing to do with... I'm not criticizing you for it. Evelyn finished the reconciliation form and signed her name. She unpinned her badge and held it out. You're doing your job. I understand that. Sandra took the badge. She seemed almost thrown by the lack of resistance. You'll receive paperwork by email. HR will contact you about the review process. All right. Sandra stopped. She looked at the badge in her hand. She looked at Evelyn. Something moved across her face, some flicker of the thing Trayvon had been less successful at hiding. The patient. The soldier. He made it to surgery. I know. How do you know? You haven't been near the OR board. Because if he hadn't, Evelyn said, I'd have heard about it by now. Sandra stood there for a moment, holding the badge, and then left without saying anything else. Evelyn stood alone in the medication room. The mountains outside the window were starting to catch color. Somewhere above her, in surgery, a man she'd never met. A man whose dog had recognized something in her that words didn't cover. Was either alive or not alive. And that was no longer her immediate concern, but it was not nothing. She picked up her bag from behind the medication cart. She walked out of the room, down the corridor, past Trayvon's station. He was on the phone, didn't see her go, and through the side exit into the parking lot. The air outside was cold and dry and smelled like high altitude and something chemical from the parking structure. She stood next to her car and breathed it in and let herself acknowledge, for exactly 15 seconds, what had happened tonight. Then she got in the car and drove. She didn't see the black SUV parked at the far end of the lot. She didn't see the man in it lower his phone after photographing her departure, or the call he made to a number that had no carrier name attached to it. She didn't see any of it. But 300 miles away, in a federal building in a city whose name she would have recognized, a light came on in an office that was never supposed to be connected to her name again. The light in the federal building stayed on for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Special Agent Renata Flood knew this because she had been the one who turned it on, and she had not left the room since. And the coffee she'd poured at the start had gone cold twice and been microwaved once, and was now something that could only charitably be called coffee. She sat at her desk with a single file open in front of her, not on her screen, on paper, the old kind that left no network trace, and read the same page for the third time without retaining any of it. The security footage from Ridgecrest Valley Hospital's emergency department was playing on a loop on the monitor to her left. 22 seconds of a woman in scrubs doing something to an airway that no civilian trauma nurse should have known how to do, followed by 4 seconds of the same woman saying 2 words to a military working dog that made it sit down like a cadet on inspection day. Flood had pulled the audio 3 times and run it through the voice analysis program that wasn't supposed to exist in the civilian intelligence infrastructure, and absolutely did. The program had given her a match probability of 91% on the second try, and on the third it had climbed to 94. She picked up her phone. She put it down. She looked at the file again. The photograph on the file's cover page was 9 years old. The woman in it was younger, unmarked, wearing a uniform with a rank insignia that corresponded to a name that had been officially retired from every active database 14 months after the photograph was taken. Retired, which was the bureaucratic word for what happened when someone died in a classified incident in a location that couldn't be named in any document that would ever see a courtroom. Flood looked at the monitor. She looked at the file. She said out loud to no one, "You're going to make my life very complicated." Then she picked up the phone and made the call she'd been sitting with for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Evelyn drove for an hour before she stopped, not because she was lost and not because she didn't know where she was going. She had 3 options mapped out and had been running the decision tree since the parking lot, but because the highway at that hour was empty and dark, and she needed the time to think without the thinking having consequences. Once she stopped somewhere, she would be somewhere. Until then, she was between things, which was a state she had learned to use. She pulled off at a rest stop outside a town called Marble Creek, which was barely a town, a gas station that looked closed, a diner that was definitely closed, a payphone still bolted to a concrete pillar that she noted out of habit. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately, the dry high-altitude cold that took the moisture out of your sinuses in about 40 seconds. And she stood next to her car and looked at the mountains, which were there in the dark the way mountains always were, present in a way that flat country never managed. The dog had recognized her. She'd told Trayvon it was about calm, about stress response, and that was true as far as it went. But Ranger hadn't just settled for a calm person. Ranger had responded to a specific command phrase from a specific operational vocabulary that was used by exactly one unit she knew of, trained in exactly the way she knew of, over a period she could narrow down to about 4 years, which meant the dog was recent, which meant the handler, Devereaux, was recent, which meant the man on the gurney had unit connections that were current, not historical. She didn't know who he was. She hadn't had time to look at identifying information before the situation had demanded other priorities, and she hadn't gone looking afterward, because going looking created a trace, and she'd spent 9 years not creating traces. But Devereaux knew something now. Maybe not specifics, maybe not enough to run anywhere useful with, but he had the phrase, he had Ranger's response, and he had the face of a woman who walked out before he could ask the follow-up question. Soldiers with that kind of training didn't let go of loose threads. She got back in the car. She had a decision to make, and the decision had a deadline, and the deadline was approximately sunrise, which was coming faster than she'd like. She drove. She chose the third option, which was a motel outside a town called Farwell that catered to long-haul truckers and asked no questions that a cash payment didn't answer. She paid for 2 nights, took the key, and sat on the edge of the bed in room 11 with her bag between her feet and ran through what she had. The short version? Not enough. The longer version? A nursing license that was real and would survive a surface check, a background that would hold up to anything short of federal-level inquiry, a car with plates registered to a name that was technically hers, and 9 years of discipline that had kept her invisible in 6 different states. Against that, she now had a face on a hospital security system, a military dog handler who'd noticed something he couldn't categorize, and whatever Sandra Kowalczyk's HR complaint would shake loose when it landed on someone's desk in the morning. She lay back on the bed without taking her shoes off and looked at the ceiling. The man on the gurney had made it to surgery. She knew that the way she knew most things about medical outcomes, pattern recognition, probability, the specific indicators she'd assessed in the trauma bay that told her his window was there if someone moved through it correctly. She had moved through it. The rest was statistics and surgical competence, and Ridgecrest's surgical team had looked competent enough. She thought about his hands. She'd noticed his hands when they transferred him to the gurney, the particular wear on them, the old healed breaks that most people wouldn't spot, the way even unconscious his body held a specific kind of tension that only came from a very particular kind of training over a very long time. He was not young. He was not someone making his first run at anything. She had no reason to think about his hands. She had no reason to think about him at all. She'd done what the situation required, and now the situation was behind her, and she had other priorities. She thought about his hands for another few minutes anyway, and then she stopped and made herself sleep. The federal building was in Denver, which was not where Renata Flood was based, which meant she spent part of the morning on a video call with 3 people whose faces she knew and whose names she used carefully, in a room she'd had swept for devices twice in the past 6 months. "The match probability concerns me," said the man on the left side of the screen. His name was Garvey, and he ran an oversight division that technically reported to people Flood had never met. 94% is not a confirmation. 94% is high enough to justify a field check, Flood said. A field check that, if it's wrong, exposes an active investigation to unnecessary visibility. And if it's right, and we don't move, we lose the only living witness to what happened at— "Don't say the location," said the woman in the center of the screen. Flood stopped. "We lose the witness," she said instead. The third person on the call, a man named Ostergaard, who rarely spoke and was usually the one who mattered most when he did, looked at something off-screen and then back at her. Who else saw the footage? The hospital security system. Automatic upload to their cloud backup, which we've already flagged with legal. The handler, Devereaux. The ER staff on shift. The attending physician. Devereaux's been briefed? Not yet. He reported the anomaly through standard channels at 0600. The report is sitting in a queue. Ostergaard nodded slowly. Pull it from the queue. Already done. Another pause. The kind of pause that meant people were doing arithmetic with lives and deciding which ones weighed more. Flood had been in enough of these calls to recognize the texture of it. "Send someone to the hospital," Ostergaard said finally. "Quietly. Confirm or deny. If it's her, contain, don't apprehend. I don't want her spooked before we have a chance to—" "She's already gone," Flood said. "She left the hospital at end of shift. I have a partial plate from the parking lot camera. The pause this time was different. She left voluntarily? After the incident with the patient? The charge nurse suspended her pending an HR review. She handed over her badge and walked out. Ostergaard looked at Garvey. Garvey looked at the woman in the center, whose name was Paris, and who ran things Flood wasn't entirely cleared to know about. If it's her, Paris said carefully, she walked out because she wanted to, not because she was forced to. That's my read, Flood said, which means she knows she was visible and she made a controlled exit. Yes. Which means she's been doing this for a while, managing visibility. 9 years, Flood said. If it's her, Paris sat back. Find her before someone else does. And Flood? She paused. Be aware that we're not the only ones who have access to hospital security feeds. The call ended. Flood sat in the swept room for a moment, and then she got up and started making different calls. Evelyn woke at noon, which was later than she'd intended, and lay still for 30 seconds, running a mental inventory before she moved. This was habit, not anxiety. The difference between them being that anxiety had no output while the inventory did. Room was secure. No sounds outside that didn't belong. Phone, a prepaid changed every 6 weeks, had no notifications. Car was where she'd left it, visible through the gap in the curtains. She sat up. She was hungry, which was information. She hadn't eaten since the meal she'd had before her shift, which was nearly 14 hours ago. And her body was noting this in the particular flat, factual way bodies noted things when they'd been trained not to dramatize. She showered, changed, and walked to the diner she'd spotted 200 yards down the road from the motel. It had opened since last night. Inside it smelled like coffee and the kind of eggs that had been on a griddle too long, and she sat at the counter and ordered both without looking at the menu and listened to the 2 men 3 stools down arguing about a water rights case that had apparently been going on for 11 years. The waitress was a woman in her 50s named Barbara, according to her name tag, and she poured coffee without being asked and didn't make conversation, which Evelyn appreciated. Her food arrived. She ate it. The eggs were exactly as overdone as they'd smelled, and the coffee was the kind of strong that suggested the pot had been on since dawn. And it was fine. It was fuel. She ate it and thought about her options, which had not improved overnight. She was reaching for her coffee when her prepaid phone buzzed. She looked at it. The number on the screen was one she'd memorized and never saved, the kind of number that existed only in 2 heads and went nowhere else. She answered. You made the news, said the voice on the other end. It was a man's voice, older, with the particular flatness of someone who had done this kind of communication for so long that tone had become a liability. Which channel? She said. No channel. Internal. You were flagged about 2 hours after your shift ended. The feed analysis picked you up. A pause. The dog didn't help. I know. How clean is your exit? Clean enough for a surface pass, not clean enough for a federal pull. Another pause, longer. They're running the plate. Evelyn set down her coffee. How do you know that? Because I have a friend in a building you've never been in, and she owed me a courtesy. She won't do it twice. His voice shifted slightly, the flatness cracking just enough to let something through that wasn't quite worry, but was adjacent to it. Evelyn, what happened in there? She looked at the counter, at the rings left by coffee cups, the small scars in the laminate, the everyday evidence of years of people sitting in this exact spot and being ordinary. Man was going to die, she said. I was there. So you let them see you. I didn't have a choice. You always have a choice. That's the whole, he would have died, she said again, and her voice was flat now too because she had learned that from somewhere, and it had become part of how she talked about certain things. The airway was going. 3 more minutes, and it wouldn't have mattered what anyone did. I was the only person in the room who saw it. The man on the other end was quiet for a moment. The soldier, do you know who he is? No. His name is Renner, Sergeant First Class Joel Renner, Special Operations. He's been running operations in a region you'd recognize for the past 4 years. A pause. He was also present at the incident. The diner sounds went quiet in Evelyn's head. Not because they stopped. Barbara was pouring more coffee somewhere down the counter. The 2 men were still arguing about water rights. But because her attention narrowed to a single point the way it did when something important arrived without warning. Which incident? She said, even though she knew. The only one that matters to you. She put her hand flat on the counter. The laminate was cool and slightly sticky and absolutely real. She pressed her palm into it. He was there, she said. He was brought in 9 days after, part of the investigation team. But yes, he has testimony. He gave a deposition that was classified and buried, and if it ever surfaces, it's the end of the network. Why are you telling me this? Because, the man said, someone else is going to figure out who he is too. And when they do, they're going to realize he just spent the night in a hospital with the only other living person whose testimony would complete the chain. She was already moving, dropping cash on the counter. Too much. Enough to cover it twice. She didn't wait for change. I'll call you back, she said. Evelyn? She was already outside, walking fast toward her car, the cold morning air hitting her face, the mountains huge and indifferent in every direction. She needed to get back to the hospital. The drive took 40 minutes, which was 37 minutes longer than she wanted it to take. She spent it running through what she knew and what she didn't know, and what the overlap between those two things meant operationally. Renner had been there. Renner had testified, and his testimony was buried, which meant someone had made sure it stayed buried, which meant someone with the access to do that had done it. The same someone, almost certainly, who had ensured that the explosion 9 years ago was classified as a training accident with no survivors, and that the investigation team's findings went nowhere they could be found. The network was not a metaphor. It was a specific group of specific people who had been stealing from military medical supply chains for long enough that it had become institutional, layered, protected by the kind of paperwork that looked legitimate from every angle except the right one. She had found the right angle 9 years ago and had been in the process of building the documentation to prove it, when the building she was working in had caught fire in a way that buildings caught fire when someone wanted something destroyed and didn't care about collateral. She had not been supposed to survive that fire. The scar on her neck was the record of how narrowly she had not survived it. Renner knew something. Maybe he knew it consciously. Maybe it was buried in a deposition he'd given under classified circumstances and half forgotten. But he was a thread, and threads got pulled, and whoever had been watching the network's perimeter for 9 years, and someone was always watching, had now been notified that 2 threads were in the same room. She pulled into the Ridgecrest Valley parking structure from the street-level entrance and found a spot on the second floor and sat in the car for 3 minutes watching traffic patterns. Then she got out and went in through the visitor entrance. She'd spent enough of last night in this building to know its geometry, the way rooms related to each other, the flow of foot traffic by department. The surgical recovery floor was on 4. She took the stairs rather than the elevator, moved at the pace of someone who belonged, and reached the 4th floor without anyone looking at her twice. The recovery ward had a nursing station at the center and rooms arrayed off 2 corridors. She scanned the board at the station while the nurse behind it was occupied with a phone call. Renner wasn't on the board, which meant either he was still in the ICU or he was in a room flagged for restricted visibility. She moved to the east corridor. 3 rooms in, she found it, a door with a different kind of hardware, a small anomaly in the gap at the frame that suggested reinforcement, and a chair outside that was currently empty but had the particular scuff pattern on the floor in front of it that came from regular occupation. Someone had been sitting outside this room all night and had recently moved. She stood in the corridor and looked at the door and thought about what she was doing and what it was going to cost, and whether she had thought this through completely. She had not thought it through completely. She was aware of this. She knocked twice and opened the door. The room was dim. The curtains were half closed. Renner was in the bed, tubes and monitors doing their accounting, his color significantly better than it had been at 4:47 this morning, which was not the same as good, but was a measurable distance from the alternative. His eyes were open. He looked at her for a long moment. "I know you," he said. His voice was rough from the intubation, the words coming out slower than they wanted to. "You don't," she said. "You were unconscious." "Not from last night." He moved his head slightly, tracking her the way people track things they were trying to pin down in memory. "From before." Evelyn stepped into the room and let the door close behind her. She looked at the monitors. His vitals were stable, the post-surgical markers within normal range. And then she looked at him. "You're going to be fine," she said. "The surgical repair was clean. You'll need 6 weeks minimum before any load-bearing activity. That's not—" He stopped, swallowed. The movement cost him something. You were in Kargar, the field station. She was very still. There was a woman, he said, combat medic. She was the one who... He stopped again, this time because something in her face had changed. Not much, barely perceptible, but he was watching the way soldiers with his training watched things, which was the way that caught the barely perceptible. There's something you need to understand, Evelyn said, and her voice was the flat, careful voice she used when there was no room for anything except the essential. Someone knows you're here. Someone connected to the network that destroyed that field station. When your handler reported what happened in the ER last night, that report was pulled from the queue, which means someone is managing information flow. And if they're managing it, they're not doing it to protect you. Renner was quiet for a moment. The monitors beeped their steady and different rhythm. The report Devereaux filed, he said. Yes. About you. About what he observed, which leads back to me. She watched him process this. He was sharp despite the medication, the way people were sharp, when sharpness had been the thing that kept them alive long enough to be anywhere at all. I need to know how much of your deposition you remember. His expression shifted into something careful and closed. I don't know what deposition you mean. Yes, you do. I'm a patient in a recovery ward. I'm not sure what you think Renner. She said his name for the first time, and it landed differently than the other words had. And he heard it, the particular way she said it that knew him without having been introduced. I don't have time for this, and neither do you. They pulled your handler's report. In my experience, the next thing that gets pulled is the witness. He looked at her for a long time. The machine above his head drew its green lines and drew them again. The supply chain records, he said finally, quietly. I gave testimony about a discrepancy I found in the forward operating base logistics. Medical supplies. The numbers didn't match the manifests by a margin that couldn't be explained by spoilage or field use. Who did you give that testimony to? Inspector General's office. A woman named... He stopped. She said it would be protected. It was classified and buried. He absorbed this. How do you know that? She didn't answer. He looked at her scar, not with the poorly concealed discomfort most people managed, but steadily, the way someone looked at a thing they were trying to date, to place in time. The field station, he said again. There was a fire. Yes. They said there were no survivors. They were wrong, Evelyn said. Outside in the corridor, something changed. She heard it before she could name it, a shift in the ambient sound, a footstep pattern that didn't belong to the routine rhythm of a recovery floor. She turned toward the door. The door opened before she reached it, and the man who walked through was wearing a hospital identification badge and a physician's white coat and had the kind of eyes that had never once in their life been warm. He wasn't a physician. She knew this with the same certainty she knew airway anatomy, and she moved left toward the wall and said sharply, Renner, which was all she got out before the man reached into the coat, and the corridor outside erupted with the sound of something very large and very angry hitting a door at full speed. The door to the recovery room burst fully open, and Ranger came through it with his leash trailing and his focus absolute. And the man in the white coat had about 1 second to understand what was happening before 90 pounds of Belgian Malinois made the decision for him. Ranger hit him at the shoulder. Not the throat, not the arm. The shoulder, which was where the dog's training directed him when the threat profile was active but not yet fully committed, which said something about the quality of Ranger's handler work, that even running free with a trailing leash he was making calibrated decisions. The man in the white coat went sideways into the door frame, and the thing in his hand, not a weapon, not exactly, a device of some kind, small and flat and wrong, skittered across the floor toward the wall. Evelyn was already moving. She crossed the room in 4 steps and got to the device before it stopped sliding, crouched without slowing, and came up with it in her left hand. She put her back against the wall next to the window and looked at what she was holding. It was a syringe auto-injector, modified. The kind of modification that didn't happen in pharmacies. In the corridor outside, there were voices now, fast and overlapping, the particular chaos of a hospital floor reacting to something that didn't fit its script. Ranger had the man pinned against the door frame, not biting, holding, the dog's body a wall of controlled aggression. And the man was making a specific calculation that Evelyn recognized as someone deciding whether to fight or absorb, which was a decision that always revealed something about what they'd been trained for and by whom. He chose to absorb. He went still. That told her more than a struggle would have. "Ranger," she said, not loudly, and the dog's ears moved, but his body didn't. She said the command phrase, the one from last night, and this time Ranger stepped back 6 inches and held, which was not releasing the threat but was acknowledging the instruction, which was the right response for a dog that had been trained by people who understood nuance. Devereaux came through the door 30 seconds later with 2 men behind him who were not in uniform but moved like they had been recently and intended to be again. He took in the scene in one sweep, the man against the door frame, Ranger, the device in Evelyn's hand, Renner in the bed, watching everything with the particular stillness of someone conserving energy for the moment it becomes essential. He came in through the service corridor, Devereaux said. Badge was legitimate. It scanned clean. He looked at Evelyn. "How did you know?" "His shoes," she said. "And the way he walked. Physicians in recovery wards don't walk like that." Devereaux looked at the man. The man looked at nothing. "What is that?" Devereaux said, meaning the device. "Auto-injector. Modified delivery mechanism. Probably potassium chloride or something with a similar cardiac signature. In a post-surgical patient with existing trauma, it reads as natural." She handed it to him by the casing without touching the mechanism. "Your forensics people will tell you more." One of the men behind Devereaux stepped forward and took the device and bagged it with practiced efficiency. The other had the man by the arm now, professional and impersonal, and the man was still looking at nothing, which was its own kind of information. Renner said, from the bed, "Are we going to keep pretending she's a nurse?" Nobody answered him immediately. Devereaux was looking at Evelyn with the same expression he'd had in the trauma bay last night, that rapid arithmetic, except now he'd had 12 hours to run the numbers, and he was somewhere different in his calculation. "I need to make a call," he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "You're not going to leave." It wasn't a question. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to leave." He held her gaze for another moment, then stepped into the corridor. The room without him was quiet except for Renner's monitors and Ranger, who had moved to sit near the foot of the bed with his attention still on the doorframe where the man had been. "Potassium chloride," Renner said. "Most likely." "They sent someone to finish me, in a hospital." "They sent someone to finish both of us," Evelyn said. "You were the easier target." He absorbed this. "And you walked back in here knowing that." She didn't answer. "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," she said, and she heard the faint sound of what might have been a laugh that his body couldn't quite complete without hurting him, so it came out as something else. The next 40 minutes were the particular kind of difficult that came from multiple institutional systems trying to establish jurisdiction over the same situation at the same time. 2 hospital security officers arrived, then a Ridgecrest City police officer, then a second police officer, then a man in a suit who said very little and showed credentials that made the police officers step back. Devereaux's call had apparently reached someone who reached someone else quickly enough that by the time the hospital administrator appeared, a man named Whitfield, 60s, the kind of carefully maintained calm that came from decades of managing liability, there was already a federal presence in the corridor that outweighed his institutional authority, and he knew it. Evelyn stood in the corner of the room and said almost nothing. She answered direct questions directly and did not volunteer additional information, which was a discipline she'd maintained for 9 years and saw no reason to abandon in the next 40 minutes. The man in the white coat was removed. The device went with him, separately. 3 different people photographed the room. Someone checked Renner's lines and monitors with the thoroughness of someone who was now treating everything as potentially compromised, which was the right instinct. Whitfield found his way to Evelyn eventually, the way administrators found their way to the anomaly in any situation. He was not unkind, just uncertain, which was its own kind of uncomfortable. "Ms. Marsh," he said, and then seemed to realize that name might not be the right entry point and stopped. "I understand you have questions," she said. "I have—" He stopped again. "I have approximately 40 questions, yes, starting with why you came back to this hospital after being suspended pending an HR review. Because someone was going to try to kill your patient, and I was the only person who knew that." He stared at her. "How did you know that?" "Because I knew why he was significant, and I knew that the people who wanted him not to be significant would eventually figure out where he was." She watched Whitfield process this, the administrator's brain trying to file the information in categories that could be managed. I know this is difficult for your hospital. Difficult, he repeated, in the tone of a man for whom that word was doing heavy lifting. I'm sorry for that part. He looked at her for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She'd formed that impression from watching him manage the previous 30 minutes. And stupid men didn't generally last long in hospital administration. Who are you? He said, which was what everyone eventually said. Someone who used to be someone else, she said, which was the most honest answer she had. He nodded slowly, in the way people nodded when they understood they weren't going to get what they were asking for and were deciding whether to keep asking. Then he turned and went back to managing his liability. The woman named Flood arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Evelyn knew who she was before she introduced herself, because she moved through the hospital corridor with the particular purposefulness of someone who had made a decision before they arrived and was now executing it, and because she looked at Evelyn with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had been looking at her photograph for 12 hours and was now making the adjustment from image to person. Special Agent Renata Flood, she said, you're going to be tired of talking today. I was tired of it at 8 this morning, Evelyn said. Something shifted in Flood's expression, not quite a smile, more the movement of facial muscles in the direction of one. Can we find somewhere that isn't a hospital corridor? They ended up in a consultation room on the 4th floor, the kind used for difficult conversations with families, with chairs that were designed to be physically neutral and managed to be physically uncomfortable instead. Flood set a recorder on the table between them and looked at Evelyn. I'm going to tell you something before I ask you anything, Flood said. The man who came in with the modified auto-injector. His real name is Garrett Lunn. He has a history that suggests contract work for private military logistics companies. 3 of those companies share a corporate parent. She paused. The parent company is part of the network you documented 9 years ago. Evelyn looked at her. We know about the documentation, Flood said. Or we know it existed. We've never been able to locate it. Because I didn't leave it somewhere locatable. I understand that. Flood's voice was careful and precise. The voice of someone who measured words the way a pharmacist measured doses. What I need you to understand is that we have been trying to reconstruct the evidentiary chain for 4 years. We have pieces. We have Renner's classified deposition. We have financial records that partially corroborate the supply chain discrepancies he identified. What we don't have is the foundational documentation, the original records that prove the network existed before Renner's deployment, before anyone was looking. The records from the field station, Evelyn said. Yes. The consultation room was very quiet. Somewhere outside the door, the hospital went about its business. They told you she was dead, Evelyn said. The investigator assigned to the field station incident was told there were no surviving witnesses and no recoverable documents. Her file was closed. Flood's eyes were steady. Her name was listed as a casualty. Her name, Evelyn said. Your name, Flood said. The words sat between them. Evelyn looked at the table, at the recorder, at her own hands. The documentation survived, she said. Flood did not move. She was very good at not moving in moments like this. Evelyn noted that, filed it, respected it. Where? Not in any digital system, not in any building. She looked up. I had 9 years to think about the most durable storage method available. Flood looked at her for a moment. Physical. Physical. Multiple copies, multiple locations, the kind of locations that don't change. She watched Flood absorb this. I can retrieve them, but I need something from you first. I'm listening. I need to know that Renner is protected. Not paperwork protected, actually protected, with people in this corridor who have more authority than a hospital security badge. She paused. And I need to know that what I give you actually goes somewhere, not into another classified file that gets buried by the same people who buried the first one. Flood was quiet for a moment. I can speak to the first thing directly. The second thing, she stopped. I'll be honest with you because I think you can tell when people aren't. There are people inside the system who are connected to this network. I don't know all of them. What I know is that the chain I'm reporting through has been audited specifically for that connection, and the 2 people at the top of my chain have the kind of records that can withstand scrutiny. I can't promise you perfect. I can promise you the best available. Evelyn looked at her. The best available, she repeated. Yes. It was not enough. It was also what there was. All right, Evelyn said. Isan. She walked Flood through it in sequence, because sequence was how evidence survived or didn't survive. The chain of custody was not bureaucratic fastidiousness. It was the thing that determined whether a document could stand up or be dismantled, and she had spent 9 years thinking about how to make what she had stand up. The original records were ledgers, not digital files, not scanned copies, physical ledgers from the supply management system of a forward operating base medical unit, the kind of paper documentation that paralleled the digital system as a redundancy measure, and was almost never the thing anyone thought to destroy because almost no one thought about the analog backup when they were in a hurry to erase digital traces. She had taken them out of the burning building in a bag she'd had on her shoulder for a different reason, and she had carried them across 3 countries with injuries she didn't fully address for 11 days because stopping to address them would have meant setting the bag down somewhere. She had never set the bag down somewhere. She described the content, dates, transfer numbers, quantities, the specific discrepancies between what was requisitioned, what was officially received, and what was actually present in inventory. The gap was not subtle, it was systematic, months of it, the kind of pattern that looked like clerical error from one angle, and from every other angle looked like someone had been running a very efficient shadow operation inside a military medical supply chain. Flood listened and took notes by hand, which Evelyn also noted and respected. The contractors identified in the ledgers, Flood said when Evelyn stopped. Were they named directly? The company names, yes. Individual names, some. The ledgers reflect the paper trail they left. They were careful but not careful enough at the receiving end, and the receiving end is where I was. You had access to the receiving records. I was the one reconciling them. She paused. That's how I found it. I was doing my job. Flood stopped writing. You were doing inventory reconciliation. Someone had to. The previous NCO responsible for it had rotated out and the replacement hadn't arrived. I picked it up because unreconciled inventory in a medical unit is a risk to patient care. She looked at Flood steadily. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy. I was looking for missing bandages. Flood set down her pen. She looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward. They tried to kill me over what inventory reconciliation found. Yes. Outside the consultation room, something changed in the ambient sound of the corridor. Evelyn heard it before she could identify it, then identified it. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving faster than hospital pace. She was on her feet before Flood finished turning toward the door. The footsteps were going to Renner's room. She knew this the way she knew things that her body had cataloged before her conscious mind had processed them, and she was through the consultation room door and into the corridor in the 3 seconds it took Flood to say her name behind her. She moved fast, not running. Running attracted attention, and attention cost seconds. But the kind of purposeful rapid walk that ate ground without triggering the ambient alarm response of a hospital floor. Devereaux was in the corridor outside Renner's room, and his posture was wrong. He was standing with the kind of stillness that came from someone holding themselves together over something that had recently happened. She reached him. What? He's stable, Devereaux said immediately, and something released in her chest that she hadn't fully acknowledged had tightened. He's stable, but... He stopped. He looked at her with that arithmetic expression, except now the numbers were different. Someone accessed his medical record in the last hour. Internally. One of the nursing staff, but the login doesn't match the shift assignment for that ID. Someone inside the hospital. Or someone using credentials from inside the hospital. His jaw was set. We found a second device, in the IV line. It wasn't there during the sweep this morning. She pushed past him and went into the room. Renner was awake, sitting at a slight incline, the monitors showing normal ranges. The IV line on his right arm had been removed and replaced with a new line in his left. He watched her come in with eyes that were tracking everything clearly. I heard, he said. Don't talk. She checked the new line, the insertion point, the tape, the drip rate. Everything looked clean. She checked anyway, the whole system, because looking clean and being clean were 2 different conditions. Who accessed this room between the device sweep and now? 3 people. The nurse, young woman, dark hair, ID badge, said Melina, and 2 orderlies who came to change the linens. And then the security officer who found the device. He paused. Melina didn't act like herself. You'd never met her before today. I know, she still didn't act like herself. He watched Evelyn finish checking the line. I've had a lot of people take care of me in a lot of different places. You know when someone's nervous because the situation is intense, and you know when someone's nervous because they're doing something they know is wrong. It's different. She looked at him. Did you say anything to her? I asked her how long she'd been at this hospital. And? She said 4 years. Then she left. He met her eyes. Melina left the floor 12 minutes ago. The real Melina has been in the cafeteria since her break started 30 minutes ago. Her badge was cloned. Flood had come in behind Evelyn, and now she was on her phone, talking in the clipped shorthand of someone mobilizing resources. Devereaux had posted himself at the door again. The room had the feeling of a space that had recently been unsafe and was now being made safe in real time, which was a different thing from actually being safe. Evelyn sat down in the chair next to Renner's bed, because her legs were registering the accumulated hours, and she had learned not to ignore that when she had the option to address it. The woman who left, she said. Did she touch the IV line? For about 4 seconds. She said she was checking the flow rate. He paused. She already knew it was wrong. She'd said it wrong, which meant the device Devereaux's team had found had not been installed this morning. It had been installed recently, and the woman with the cloned badge had come to activate or verify it, and had left when she'd accomplished whatever she'd come for or when she'd decided the room was too active. Was there a secondary mechanism? Evelyn asked. That's what the device team is trying to determine, Devereaux said from the door. Right now, I'd rather get him off this floor. Moving him creates exposure in transit, Evelyn said. Keeping him here creates exposure in place. The transit window is more predictable to an outside threat. At least here we can control who comes through the door. We thought we were controlling that already. She acknowledged this with a nod, because he was right, and being right mattered even when it was inconvenient. What's the option? There's a secure annex attached to this facility. Army Corps built it in 2019 for exactly this kind of situation. It's never been used. She looked at him. Does it connect directly to this building? Internal corridor. No external exposure. Who knows it exists? Officially, the hospital board, the Corps liaison, and a small operational planning team. He paused. Unofficially, I don't know. She thought about this. The problem with secure facilities was that they existed, which meant they could be known about, which meant the security they offered was conditional on not being the obvious move. Moving Renner to the annex was the obvious move. If they know it exists, she said, they'll be watching the corridor. If they don't, it's the safest place in this building. That's a significant if. Renner, who had been listening to this exchange with the quiet attention of someone who understood they were the subject of it, said, I have a third option. They both looked at him. I don't stay here at all. He said it carefully, with the deliberateness of someone working around the physical cost of saying things. You get me ambulatory and you move me somewhere that isn't on any plan, official or otherwise. You had abdominal surgery 16 hours ago, Evelyn said flatly. I know that. Ambulating you beyond this ward is not a medical option right now. You just said you could make options in fields where there weren't supposed to be any. That's different. Is it? He looked at her steadily. The medication had brought his color back, but it had also stripped some of his filter, and what was underneath was the kind of directness that came from a long time of making decisions in conditions where indirectness costs lives. How many times has a building I was in been the variable that got me in trouble? She didn't have an answer for that, because she didn't know his history, and because it was a reasonable question. Flood came off her phone. We have a problem, she said. The room looked at her. Garrett Lunn, the man with the auto-injector. He's been transferred to a federal holding facility pending processing. She paused. 40 minutes ago, his attorney appeared. She has the kind of credentials that don't appear in 40 minutes without significant foreknowledge and preparation. Who is she? Devereaux said. Someone named Kara Sellers. She's out of Washington. She has no public record of representing anyone connected to private military contracting. But, Evelyn said, but she's represented 3 people who were tangentially connected to companies in the network's corporate structure over the past 5 years. Never directly, always once removed. Flood's voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. She's good enough that it took me 4 years to find the connection, and I almost missed it. Which means, Evelyn said, which means the network knew he was in custody within the hour, and they responded within the hour. Flood looked at her. They're moving fast. Faster than we are. The room was quiet for a moment. Ranger, who had been lying near the door, lifted his head and looked at the corridor. Not at the door. Through it. At something in the corridor that hadn't arrived yet. Evelyn was watching him. She knew what it meant when Ranger lifted his head like that. She knew it the same way she'd known the phrase that settled him, from a part of her memory that didn't consult the rest of herself before responding. Devereaux, she said quietly. He was already moving. The corridor door opened from the outside before Devereaux reached it, and it wasn't a nurse, and it wasn't a physician, and it wasn't anyone who belonged on this floor during visiting hours, and there were two of them, and they moved like the man with the modified auto-injector had moved, which was to say, like people who had decided what they were going to do before they got here. Ranger launched before anyone said anything. The first man went down. The second one cleared the door and had a device in his hand that Evelyn recognized in the fraction of a second before Devereaux hit him from the side, and they went into the corridor wall together, and the device, a taser, modified, she'd process that later, discharged against the wall and left a black mark in the paint, and nothing else. She was at Renner's bedside. She had her hand on his arm, the reflex of someone whose first response to threat near a patient was to physically anchor them to the bed and prevent them from doing something that would undo 16 hours of surgical repair. He had already started to move, already reaching for something. Instinct, his body's own training responding before his conscious mind could override it. And she pressed down with enough force to communicate that this was not a request. "Stay," she said. He stopped. He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. "Stay," she said again. In the corridor, there was a very loud noise, and then there was a different quality of silence. Flood stepped out of the room. She was on her phone again, and the words coming out of her mouth were the kind of words that moved large numbers of people rapidly in the same direction. Devereaux came back through the door. He had a cut above his eye that he wasn't acknowledging. "Two down. Building is being locked." "How many more?" Evelyn said. "I don't know." He looked at her directly. "This is no longer a hospital security situation. It hasn't been a hospital security situation since 4:47 this morning." "No." He touched the cut above his eye, briefly and without particular interest. "I need to know what you know. Everything. Now." He pulled a chair to the center of the room and sat on it backward, his arms across the back, his eyes on her. "Because whatever is in those records you described to Flood, someone just sent two people to this floor to make sure it never gets used, and I need to understand why." Flood came back in from the corridor. She was pale in the way people were pale when they'd received information that changed the shape of the situation. "They found the woman with the cloned badge," she said. "Good," Devereaux said. "No." Flood looked at Evelyn. "They found her in a supply closet on the second floor. She's alive, but she was subdued before she got to the floor, which means the woman who came in with her badge was never Ridgecrest staff," Evelyn said. "No, she was a plant. And the devices in Renner's room—" Flood stopped. She said the next sentence carefully. "The device team says the secondary mechanism wasn't triggered, but they can't tell yet if that's because someone stopped it or because it's still waiting to be triggered." The room went completely still. Evelyn looked at Renner's IV line. She looked at the new insertion point, the new line, all of it replaced after the first device was found. She thought about what she knew about layered systems, redundant mechanisms, the way people who built traps built them. "Get him out of the line entirely," she said. "Oral hydration only until everything gets swept by someone I trust, not someone cleared by this building's existing security chain." "You don't trust the sweep team," Devereaux said. "I trust that they're competent. I don't trust that the chain they're working from hasn't been compromised." She met his eyes. Someone knew the annex existed. Someone knew the badge cloning window. Someone knew exactly which room Renner was in and which shift supervisor to route the fake credentials through. She paused. "This is not an outside attack. Part of this is inside." The silence this time was different from the others. It had weight. Renner said, from the bed, quietly, "That's what I told the Inspector General 9 years ago." Everyone looked at him. "The deposition." His voice was rough but clear. "The thing I said that they buried, it wasn't just about the supply chain discrepancies." He looked at Evelyn. "I said I thought the oversight structure had been compromised, that the people responsible for catching this kind of theft were the same people facilitating it." He paused. They buried it in 3 days. That's fast, even for classified material. Flood had gone very still. Agent Flood, Evelyn said. Flood looked at her. The 2 people at the top of your reporting chain, Evelyn said. The ones you told me had been audited. Flood's jaw tightened slightly. It was barely visible, but Evelyn was watching for it. Yes. Who conducted the audit? The silence that followed was the longest one yet, and in it, Flood's face did something that faces did when a person who had been certain of something for a long time suddenly had a reason not to be. Not panic, not collapse, but a specific recalibration, the expression of someone rerunning calculations in real time and arriving at an answer they hadn't expected and didn't want. I need to make a call, Flood said very quietly. Who to? Devereaux said. She looked at him and then at Evelyn, and then she said the name of a person and a division that made Devereaux straighten up in his chair and made Evelyn go completely still for the first time since she'd walked back through the hospital's front doors. Because the name Flood said belonged to the same oversight structure that Renner's buried deposition had named as compromised. Flood didn't make the call. She stood in the middle of Renner's hospital room with her phone in her hand and her thumb over the contact, and she didn't press it, and the 3 seconds she spent not pressing it said more than anything she could have said out loud. Then she put the phone in her pocket. I need to think about the chain, she said. Her voice was controlled, but it was the control of someone applying pressure to something that wanted to move. If Renner's deposition named that division as compromised, and the audit of my reporting chain was conducted through that division, then the audit means nothing, Evelyn said. The audit means nothing, Flood repeated. She said it quietly, the way people said things they needed to hear themselves say in order to fully understand them. She looked at the wall for a moment, then back at the room. I have one contact completely outside that structure. She's DOJ, not DOD. She's been working financial crimes for 11 years, and she has no overlap with military contracting oversight. Can you trust her? Devereaux said. She testified against her own division chief 4 years ago for evidence tampering, cost her a promotion and 2 years of desk assignment. Flood's jaw set. Yes, I can trust her. Then call her, Evelyn said, but not on that phone. Flood looked at her. The department phone is issued by a department that may have compromised infrastructure. Use mine. She held out the prepaid. It's clean. Changed 6 weeks ago. No registered identity. Flood took it. She looked at it for a moment. The cheap plastic casing, the anonymous weight of it, and something moved across her face that might have been the recognition of how long Evelyn had been living inside the discipline of this kind of caution. She went into the corridor. Devereaux looked at Evelyn. DOJ financial crimes, he said. How long does it take them to move? Depends on what Flood gives them and how much they already have. She looked at Renner, who had his eyes closed but was not asleep. She could tell by the quality of his stillness, the slight tension in his jaw. Renner. The deposition. Was it recorded or written? He opened his eyes. Both. Written transcript, audio recording. They told me both copies were classified and secured. Classified by whom specifically? The IG officer who took my testimony. A man named Pruitt. She looked at Devereaux. Devereaux looked at her. Pruitt, she said. I don't know the name. I do. She turned it over in her locating it. 9 years was a long time, but certain names stayed because they'd been attached to certain moments. And the moment she attached Pruitt to was a phone call she'd overheard 2 days before the field station fire. A voice through a wall, a name spoken twice, and the specific cadence of someone being given instructions rather than having a conversation. He was connected to the contracting side. I heard his name mentioned in the context of the supply chain operation. I didn't know what it meant then. You know what it means now, Devereaux said. He took Renner's deposition and buried it because burying it protected him. She looked at Renner. Do you know where Pruitt is now? Last I heard, he'd moved up. Deputy director level. IG's office, DOD. Renner's voice was flat. He sent a commendation letter for my last deployment. The room sat with that for a moment. He commended you, Devereaux said. People like that do that, Renner said. It's how they stay invisible. You don't suspect the person who praised you. It was true, and it was ugly, and it was exactly the kind of thing that made networks like this one survive for decades. The social architecture of manufactured goodwill layered over institutional corruption until no one could find the seam between them. Flood came back in. She handed the prepaid to Evelyn. "She's moving," she said, and something in her voice had changed, tighter, but also somehow more solid, the way things got when decision replaced uncertainty. "Her name is Vashti Omondi. She's been building a parallel financial case for 14 months. She has corporate records, wire transfer documentation, shell company structures. She has almost everything except the originating supply chain records." She paused. She said, "If what you described exists, it closes the loop on every gap she has." "How soon can she get here?" "She's in Denver. 4 hours, maybe 3 if she moves now. She's moving now." Flood looked at her. She also said she's been trying to find a way into this case that doesn't go through the DoD oversight structure. She's been stopped twice by jurisdictional objections from Pruitt's division. "Pruitt," Evelyn said. Flood stopped. "You know that name. Tell me what you know about him first." "Deputy Director, DoD, Inspector General. 18-year career, clean record, 1 commendation from the Joint Chiefs." Flood's eyes were steady. "And his name appears twice in the financial records Omondi has. In the metadata of 2 documents that were edited after submission. The edits removed a contractor name." "Which contractor?" Flood named it. It was one of the names in the ledgers. Evelyn sat down. Not because she needed to, but because the weight of 9 years of carrying something alone had just shifted, incrementally but perceptibly, and her body registered it before she did. She sat in the chair next to Renner's bed and put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "He was in the chain," she said, "from the beginning. He wasn't downstream of the operation. I was part of the architecture." "You have documentation of that?" Flood said. "The ledgers show the receiving end. Omondi has the financial end. Renner's deposition is the operational testimony." She looked up. 3 separate bodies of evidence from 3 separate sources who never compared notes. Pruitt managed to suppress all 3 independently because they never came together. She paused. "They're together now." The next 3 hours were the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside. Devereaux coordinated a security rotation that brought in personnel from a different chain of command entirely. Army CID investigators who reported through a line that had no intersection with Pruitt's division. It took 2 calls and a direct authorization from a general officer whose name Devereaux used with the particular economy of someone who understood that names like that were resources to be spent carefully. The hospital floor was cleared of non-essential staff. Whitfield, the administrator, received a federal order that he read twice and then complied with without further comment, because it was the kind of order that left no interpretive flexibility. Sandra Kowalczyk, who had come in for the afternoon shift and found her emergency department adjacent to what was now effectively a federal crime scene, stood in the corridor outside the nursing station with her arms crossed and the expression of someone revising their understanding of recent events in real time. Evelyn passed her in the corridor once, going in the opposite direction. Sandra said, "I owe you an apology." Evelyn stopped. She looked at her. Sandra looked back, not flinching, which was something. "You were doing your job," Evelyn said. "Same as last night." "I stripped your assignment because you made me uncomfortable. That's not... You stripped my assignment because my credentials had irregularities, and you were responsible for patient safety. That's exactly what you should have done." She held Sandra's gaze. "The discomfort was separate." "I know." Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Who are you?" she said, which was what everyone said, but she said it differently than the others had, not with the weight of institutional authority or federal urgency, just the plain question of one person looking at another and trying to understand what they were seeing. "Someone who was trying to be a nurse," Evelyn said. "I was actually starting to like it." She kept walking. Vashti Omondi arrived at 4:52 in the afternoon, which was 3 hours and 11 minutes after Flood's call, which meant she had driven fast and hadn't stopped. She was a small woman with close-cut hair and the organized efficiency of someone who had spent years doing work that required moving large amounts of information through small jurisdictional windows before someone closed them. She shook Evelyn's hand with a grip that meant business, and looked at her with eyes that had apparently already processed everything Flood had told her, and were now running calibration on the gap between the briefing and the person. "The ledgers," she said. No preamble. "How many volumes?" 4. Covering 14 months of supply operations at the FOB level and 6 months of the preceding requisition chain. Specific enough to tie individual transfers to individual contractors? Specific enough to tie specific shipments to specific invoices to specific company names to specific dates? The contractors signed the receiving documentation themselves because they thought the analog copies would be destroyed with everything else. Omondi looked at her for a moment. They didn't know you'd taken them. No. They thought they were burning the only copies. They thought they were burning everything. Evelyn's voice stayed even. They were thorough. They just missed one bag. Omondi looked at Flood. Flood looked back. Something passed between them that was the professional shorthand of two people who had been working toward the same endpoint from different directions for long enough that finally being in the same room felt slightly surreal. I need to see them, Omondi said. I need something from you first, Evelyn said. Omondi turned back to her. She didn't look impatient, just attentive. The specific attentiveness of someone who understood that this was a negotiation, and that the person across from them held the variable that determined its outcome. My name, Evelyn said. My actual name. The service record attached to it. The rank, the deployment history, the commendations. All of it was officially retired when I was listed as a casualty. I need it restored. Not as a courtesy, not as a future consideration. Before I take you to the ledgers. Omondi was quiet for a moment. That's a DoD records action. I'm DOJ. You have a contact in DoD records. You've used them twice in the past 14 months to verify contractor licensing histories. I know this because Flood told me your case structure, and that kind of verification requires a records liaison. She watched Omondi's expression, which didn't change much but changed a little. I'm not asking you to do it through channels that touch Pruitt's division. I'm asking you to use the contact you already have. Another pause. Omondi looked at Flood again. She's right about the contact, Flood said simply. Omondi looked back at Evelyn. If I make that call, it signals that we're moving. Pruitt may have visibility into records access requests. Then make it at the same time we go to the ledgers. Give him nothing to respond to before we have everything in your custody. Evelyn paused. He's been managing information flow for 9 years. The way you take that apart is you move faster than the flow. Omondi studied her for a long moment, the look of someone taking a final measurement. All right, she said. Now, the ledgers were in 3 locations, which was how Evelyn had thought about storage. Never one place, never two, never anywhere that could be connected to her by a straight line. The first location was 60 miles north, a self-storage facility outside a town called Delwood, where a unit had been rented under a business name that had been legally registered to a Colorado LLC for 7 years and had never conducted any business. The second was 40 miles east, a safety deposit box in a credit union branch, the kind of institution that didn't share records with federal databases without a specific court order and didn't receive those orders often. The third was 80 miles south, embedded in a storage arrangement inside a veterinary clinic, whose owner owed Evelyn a favor she'd never collected. She told Omondi and Flood where they were. She did not tell them the access details yet. Old habit and not unreasonable. They left the hospital in 2 vehicles, which was Devereaux's call and the right one. He came himself and brought 2 CID agents who hadn't been inside Ridgecrest building until an hour ago and had no history with its existing security structure. Ranger rode in the first vehicle, which Evelyn was also in, which she suspected was not accidental on Devereaux's part. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat. The mountains were doing the late afternoon thing, the light hitting them at the angle that made them look painted, which was the kind of observation she usually suppressed because it wasn't tactically useful, and she'd trained herself out of things that weren't tactically useful. She let herself have it anyway. It took 2 seconds. You've been in Colorado the whole time? Devereaux said. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the road, the way a driver's eyes should be, but the question wasn't casual. Most of it. 2 years in New Mexico, 1 in Wyoming. Staying close to the storage locations. Partly. She looked at the road. Partly because I didn't know where else to be. He didn't respond to that immediately. He let it sit, which she appreciated. The landscape moved past them, the sprawl at the edge of Ridgecrest giving way to high-altitude open country, the kind of terrain that made cities feel like recent ideas. The unit, he said, the command phrase you used with Ranger. That's not published anywhere. That's not in any public-facing training documentation. No. Which means you either trained with a unit that uses that protocol, Or you trained someone who does. Or I was trained by someone who does, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Which is it? She looked out the window. I was attached to a special operations medical support element for 14 months, before the phobia assignment. She paused. Ranger's protocol is at least 8 years old. He would have been trained under it from the beginning. So he recognized the phrase. He recognized the phrase and the cadence and probably the body chemistry, which dogs read better than people do. She glanced back at Ranger, who was lying in the rear compartment with his head up, watching the road through the windshield with the serene attention of a dog who understood car travel as purposeful movement. He's a good dog. He's an exceptional dog, Devereaux said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was different from the operational clipping he used for everything else. He's the one who found the second device, before the sweep team did. He went to the IV stand and sat. He paused. I should have listened to him immediately. You moved within the right window, she said. He's fine. Renner's fine. The device wasn't triggered. She looked at the road. You can't run on retrospective liability in this kind of work. You make the decision with what you have at the time you have it. He glanced at her. 9 years of solo operational security will make you philosophical. 9 years of anything will make you philosophical. The Delwood storage facility was exactly as she'd left it, which was the only relationship she had with anything she'd left in the past 9 years. The relationship of things remaining where she'd put them, unchanging, which was its own kind of comfort and its own kind of loneliness. The unit contained 2 fireproof document boxes and a third container she'd fabricated herself from materials that would survive water and smoke, which she knew about from experience. She cut the seals she'd put on the containers, distinctive seals, the kind you'd know had been tampered with, and opened them in front of Omondi, who leaned over the first box with the expression of someone who had been looking for something for a long time and had just been handed it. She didn't touch the ledgers yet. She photographed them first, in position, then put on nitrile gloves, she'd brought a box, and began going through them with the systematic attention of someone who had been carrying documents in her head for so long that finding them physically unchanged was almost disorienting. This is the first requisition block, Evelyn said, pointing to the third ledger. Months 1 through 6 of the discrepancy period. The handwriting on the receiving signatures is consistent across entries, which means the same individual was signing falsified receipts for the entire period. That individual's signature can be matched to contractor personnel records. Omondi was photographing pages with a camera that was not a phone, a dedicated device with encrypted storage. The dollar figures, she said, not looking up. Are they gross totals or per item? Per item with running totals. The page margins have handwritten reconciliation notes. Those are mine. Omondi looked up at that. I was reconciling inventory in real time, Evelyn said. I was tracking the discrepancy as I found it. The margin notes are my working documentation. She paused. My handwriting can be verified against samples from my service record once that record is restored. Omondi looked at her for a moment, then back at the ledger. The margin notes are dated. Yes. They predate the field station fire by 3 weeks. Yes. Which means you found this 3 weeks before 3 weeks before someone decided I needed to not have found it. Evelyn's voice was level. I have a letter I drafted during that period. I was trying to find the correct reporting channel. I didn't know yet that the correct reporting channel was compromised. She paused. The letter is in the safety deposit box. Omondi straightened. She looked at Evelyn with the expression of someone making a final structural assessment before committing to a load-bearing decision. Everything you've described, she said carefully. The ledgers, the margin notes, the letter, together with Renner's deposition and my financial records, this is a complete evidentiary chain, originating documentation, operational testimony, financial tracing. She paused. Pruitt is in this. Pruitt is in the ledgers, Evelyn said, not by name, by the document trail. 3 supply transfers were routed through an authorization code that traces to his office during his tenure at the contracting oversight level. He was a mid-level officer then, not a deputy director. He had the access and the motive and the position. 18 years, Omondi said quietly. He's been climbing for 18 years. Using a network he helped build to fund the climb. Evelyn closed the first box. He didn't stay in the network because he needed it. He stayed because he was afraid of it, The people above him in the contractor structure knew what he'd done. They owned him. She looked at Omondi. He buried Renner's deposition because the contractors told him to. He's not the architect. He's leverage. Omondi was very still. Who's the architect? That's in the third location. Oops. They didn't go to the third location that night. Omondi made the call about Evelyn's records from the parking lot of the Delwood facility, standing in the last of the light, with her back to the storage units and her voice low and precise. And the call lasted 9 minutes. And when she came back, her face said that the contact had confirmed they could process a military records correction through an internal channel that predated the current DoD oversight reorganization. A channel, Omondi explained, that Pruitt's division had tried to have decommissioned 3 years ago and failed, because the records office chief at the time had been intractable about it. The correction will be logged in the old system first, Omondi said. It'll propagate to the current system within 48 hours. That's not complete restoration, Evelyn said. It's irrevocable initiation. Once it's in the old system, it can't be suppressed without triggering an audit trail that goes to 3 separate oversight bodies simultaneously. Omondi looked at her directly. It's the best available. Evelyn looked at the mountains, which were losing their color now, the sky above them going deep and cold. The best available. She'd heard that phrase today before from Flood, and it was still not enough and still what there was. All right, she said, the same way she'd said it then. They went back to Ridgecrest that night with the first 2 sets of documents in Omondi's custody, sealed in evidence containers that had been logged and photographed. The safety deposit box in the credit union required the branch manager's authorization at this hour, which Flood arranged through a federal emergency access order that the branch manager received on his home phone and complied with, unhappily and without further resistance. The letter was there. The remaining ledger was there. Omondi sat in the branch manager's office with the letter on the desk in front of her and read it twice without saying anything. Then she looked at the date at the top. Then she looked at Evelyn. You wrote this 11 days before the fire, she said. Yes. You were documenting your attempt to find a reporting channel. I wanted a paper record of the attempt, in case I needed to prove later that I had tried. You wrote it in case they stopped you. Evelyn looked at the letter. It was 3 pages, handwritten, the penmanship slightly compressed the way her penmanship always was when she was writing under the kind of focus that tightened everything. She had not seen it in 4 years, had not gone to that box in 4 years because she'd maintained a distance from all 3 locations that she felt was operationally prudent. Seeing it now was different from how she'd expected it to feel. It felt smaller than the thing she'd been carrying. That was always how it was. I wrote it in case they stopped me, she said, and they stopped me anyway. But the letter survived. The letter survived. Omondi picked up her phone and called someone and began talking in the clipped, measured language of someone building a legal structure in real time. Evelyn sat in one of the branch manager's chairs and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular exhaustion that came not from the day, but from 9 years of holding the same position and finally being able to move. Flood came in at some point and sat in the other chair and said nothing, which was exactly right. After a while, Flood said, Omondi's team will move on Pruitt by morning. Will he run? He doesn't know we have this yet. We've managed the information flow from this end. Flood paused. Garrett Lunn, the man from the hospital, his attorney, Sellers, made a filing 2 hours ago. Omondi's team flagged it. Sellers requested an emergency hearing on jurisdictional grounds. That's how they always move when they know they're exposed. Who told Sellers they were exposed? We don't know yet. Evelyn looked at her. Inside your team. Flood didn't flinch. I'm operating on that assumption. Who has access to what Omondi retrieved today? Omondi, me, Devereaux, and 2 CID agents, and you. When did Sellers file? 6:40 this evening. Evelyn went through the timeline. They'd left Ridgecrest for Delwood at 4:15. Omondi had made her calls from the parking lot at 5:40. The credit union was 6:20. Sellers filed before we reached the credit union, she said. Flood was quiet for a moment. Yes. Which means whoever told her didn't know about the third location. No. Which means the leak is someone who knew about the first 2 but not the third. And the only people who knew about all 3 are in this room and in Renner's hospital room. Yes, Flood said. I've already started narrowing it. Evelyn looked at her. Flood looked back, And her expression was the expression of someone who had been in this profession long enough to not be surprised by betrayal, but had not yet become indifferent to it, which was probably what kept her good at her job. "The third location," Evelyn said. "We haven't told anyone else." "No. Don't." She sat forward. "Tell the team we're going tomorrow morning. Tell them the location is 80 miles south." "That's what you told us." "But don't tell them what specifically. No address, no name. Just the direction and the distance." She paused. "If someone moves tonight based on that, if there's any activity in that corridor, you have your answer." Flood was quiet for a long moment. Then, "That's using the evidence as bait." "It's using the gap in their knowledge as a diagnostic tool," Evelyn said. "The evidence is in a veterinary clinic in a town called Sutter Creek. The clinic owner is a woman named Adele Varga. She has a ranch dog that needed a surgery 3 years ago that no local vet would attempt. I did it in her barn." She paused. "She doesn't know what she's storing. She thinks it's personal documents. She's not a target unless someone knows where to look." Flood was writing. "If someone moves on Sutter Creek tonight," Evelyn said, "they got there from information that only circulated in one direction. And if no one moves, then we go in the morning and we finish it." Flood put her pen down. She looked at the letter from the branch manager's desk, still lying where Omondi had left it, 3 pages of compressed handwriting that were 9 years old and had been waiting this entire time. "One more thing," Flood said. She said it carefully, in the tone of something she'd been holding until the right moment. "Renner, he said something while you were getting ready to leave. He asked me to tell you—" She stopped. "He said to tell you he remembers the field station. He said he remembers a combat medic who carried him out of a burning building while she was on fire." She paused. "He said he told himself for 9 years that she didn't make it, because that was what they told him." Evelyn looked at the letter. At the date at the top, 11 days before everything, in handwriting that was hers but also felt like a record of someone she'd left behind in a burning building. "He can tell me himself when he's ambulatory," she said. Flood nodded. In Omondi's vehicle outside, there were documents and a chain of evidence that had taken 9 years to complete. In Sutter Creek, 80 miles south, there was a ranch dog that had needed surgery, and a barn, and a woman who'd asked no questions, and a box that contained the final piece. And somewhere in the direction of Denver, in an office in a federal building, a man named Pruitt had spent 18 years believing that certain things were safely buried. He had not been wrong about that until today. At 2 in the morning, Flood's phone lit up with a notification from a surveillance package that had been installed on a road camera outside a town called Sutter Creek, a camera that should have seen no traffic at this hour, on a county road that led to nothing except ranches and distance. It had seen 2 vehicles moving without headlights. Flood was already calling Omondi when Evelyn read the notification over her shoulder. 2 vehicles, no headlights, county road outside Sutter Creek, 2:08 in the morning. The camera had a 12-second capture window and had caught both vehicles entering the frame and exiting it, moving at the speed of people who knew where they were going and didn't want to be seen getting there. Omondi picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep either. Flood gave her the information in 9 words. Omondi said 4 back. The call ended. Evelyn was already moving toward the door. "Wait," Flood said. "Adele Varga is in that barn," Evelyn said. "She doesn't know what's coming. You have vehicles that are 30 minutes from Sutter Creek in the best case, and those 2 cars were already on the road." She looked at Flood. "I'm 17 minutes out. I know the property." Flood looked at her for exactly 2 seconds, which was the amount of time it took a person to run a calculation they already knew the answer to. "Devereaux goes with you." "I know." She didn't wait for the rest of it. "But—" Devereaux drove. He drove the way the Army had taught him to drive, which was fast and without wasted movement. And the county road outside Ridgecrest at 2 in the morning was empty enough that fast meant something. Ranger was in the back. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that had too many stars, the kind of sky that only existed above 8,000 feet, and reminded you that the atmosphere was thin up here and the world was large and mostly indifferent to what happened inside it. Evelyn watched the road and thought about Adele Varga. She was 63, widowed, had run the ranch alone for 11 years since her husband's heart attack. She kept 3 horses, a herd of mixed cattle, and a ranch dog named Biscuit, who had needed an emergency surgery 3 years ago when he'd gotten into something he shouldn't have and his gut had twisted. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was 90 miles away, and the dog wouldn't survive the drive. Evelyn had been working out of a small animal clinic in the next county, and Adele had called the clinic's after-hours line, and Evelyn had driven out and done the surgery in the barn with equipment she'd brought in a case, and Adele had stood beside her and held a flashlight for 4 hours without shaking and without asking a single unnecessary question. Afterward, Adele had offered to pay. Evelyn had said she'd take storage space instead, if Adele had any. Adele had looked at her with the particular eyes of a woman who had spent 63 years learning to read people, and said that she had a storage room off the back of the barn, and that what people kept in their storage rooms was their own business. That had been 3 years ago. They'd had coffee twice since then. Biscuit was fine. "How far?" Devereaux said. 6 minutes. The property's off a dirt track 1/2 mile from the county road. There's a main gate, but the track loops around the back of the property through a stand of cottonwoods. They might not know about the loop. Might, she agreed. She looked at the road. Adele will have heard them. She's a light sleeper and she knows the sound of vehicles on her property. Will she do something about it? Evelyn thought about the woman who had held a flashlight for 4 hours without shaking. Yes, she said. That's what I'm worried about. They came in on the backtrack, lights off for the last 1/2 mile, and Evelyn navigated from memory. The gap in the cottonwoods, the slight rise before the barn, the way the track curved left and then straightened toward the back of the property. The barn was a dark shape ahead. The main house was 50 yards beyond it, and there was a light on in the house that hadn't been on when Evelyn last left this property, which meant Adele was awake. One vehicle was parked at the barn's main entrance. The second was not visible, which was worse than seeing it. Devereaux cut the engine 60 yards out. They sat in silence for a moment. 2 vehicles, unknown number of personnel, he said quietly. 1 confirmed location, 1 unknown. The storage room is on the east side of the barn. External access padlocked. She looked at the barn. The main doors were shut. If they know what they're looking for, they're already at the east door. If they don't? They're inside looking. He reached back and unclipped Ranger's lead. Ranger came forward between the seats and looked out the windshield with his ears forward and his breathing steady. Evelyn looked at him. East side, she said quietly, in the cadence he recognized. Stay. Ranger looked at her. His ears moved. He's not going to stay? Devereaux said. He'll stay until I give the secondary command. She looked at Devereaux. I'll go to the house. Adele needs to not be in the yard with a shotgun when your backup arrives. You're not trained. I've been taking care of myself for 9 years, she said. Not with heat, just with the plainness of a fact. I'll go to the house. You go to the east wall. Wait for backup before you go through the door. He looked at her. Define wait. If someone comes out of that door before backup arrives, use your judgment. She pushed the car door open slowly, without the latch clicking. That's what I do. She moved across the open ground in a low, fast walk, the same way she'd moved across worse ground in worse light, and the barn was between her and the parked vehicle, and she used it the whole way to the house. The front porch light was off. The light she'd seen was in the back, kitchen, or mudroom. She went around the side. Adele was in the kitchen. She was standing at the window above the sink, looking toward the barn, and she had a rifle, a bolt action, older, the kind of rifle a ranch carried for practical reasons, leaning against the wall next to her. She was in a flannel shirt and her boots, which meant she'd heard them and had gotten dressed, which was exactly the kind of thing Evelyn had expected. She knocked on the back door twice, lightly, in the particular pattern she'd used the first night she came out here with her case of equipment. It had been an instinct then, marking herself as herself. It was useful now. Adele opened the door in 4 seconds, which meant she'd been right next to it. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at the property behind her. She said, I figured it was connected to you. I'm sorry, Evelyn said. Don't be sorry. Be useful. Adele stepped back from the door. There are 2 of them at the barn. One went in the main door, one went around the east side. I heard the padlock go. They have a key? They cut it. I heard the bolt cutters. She looked at Evelyn steadily. Whatever's in that room, they're going to find it in about 3 minutes. I know. She stepped inside. I need you to stay in this house until people arrive. Federal agents. They're 12 minutes out. And until then? Until then, a soldier named Devereaux is at the east wall. She held Adele's gaze. He's good at his job. Adele looked at her for a long moment with those 63 years of reading people. The dog, she said. He's good at his too. Adele nodded once, and that was the whole negotiation. What happened at the barn in the next 11 minutes was not clean. Evelyn heard most of it from the kitchen window. The shout from the east side, then a second voice, then Ranger's bark, which was the short, sharp bark of a dog who had been given his secondary command and had made a decision about where to apply it. Then something that was not a gunshot but was loud enough to matter, and then voices in a register that meant people being controlled rather than people being free. The backup arrived at the 11-minute mark, which was 1 minute ahead of Flood's estimate. 4 vehicles, 2 of them bearing federal credentials, and 2 of them bearing Army CID identifiers, coming up the main track with lights on now because the need for quiet approach had passed. Evelyn went out of the house when she saw the lights. She crossed the yard to the barn. Devereaux had 2 men face down in the dirt outside the east door, his knee in the back of the closer one, the other secured with zip ties that the CID agents were now verifying. Ranger was sitting 6 feet away, watching the proceedings with the alert calm of a dog who understood that the active portion of his assignment had concluded. The east door was open. The storage room inside was a rectangle of shadow, and the box was visible on the shelf where Adele had put it 3 years ago, undisturbed, because the 2 men had been coming through the door when Devereaux arrived and had not made it to the box. Evelyn walked to the doorway and looked at the box for a moment. Then she turned around and looked at the 2 men in the dirt, and she recognized one of them from the photograph Flood had shown her 2 hours ago. A mid-level contractor field operative, whose name was in the financial records, 1 step removed from the corporate parent, the kind of person who did the physical work that kept the architecture of a network intact. He turned his head in the dirt and looked at her. His face was doing the calculation of someone trying to determine what leverage they still had. "You should have stayed gone," he said. She had heard almost exactly these words before, from Garrett Lunn in Renner's hospital room, and she registered the echo of it, the way the network had one vocabulary for the people it considered threats. The same words recycled because the playbook was old and they'd never needed a new one. "I know," she said. "That's what made it so easy to come back." Omondi arrived at 4 in the morning with a document team and an evidence protocol that was thorough enough to make the previous night's work look preliminary. The box came out of the storage room properly, photographed in situ, logged, transferred to sealed containers that went into a chain of custody that now had 4 independent signatures at each step, because Omondi was building something that would need to survive every legal challenge that well-resourced attorneys could construct. Evelyn sat on the porch of Adele's house and drank coffee that Adele had made without being asked, and watched the federal machinery process the property, and felt something she didn't have an immediate name for. Adele sat in the other porch chair and said nothing for a long time. "Biscuit's doing well," she said eventually. "Good. He chased a coyote last week, didn't catch it, but he ran it to the fence line." She looked at her coffee. "He's got some years left in him still." "He was always going to," Evelyn said. Adele looked at her sideways. "You knew that night, didn't you, that he'd be fine?" "I thought he would be." "But you came anyway." Evelyn looked at the people moving around her barn in the pre-dawn light. "I came anyway," she said. Adele nodded. She was quiet again for a moment. "Whatever you were carrying in there," she said. "I hope it's lighter now." Evelyn looked at the mountains. They were starting to separate from the dark, the ridgeline becoming visible against a sky that was still deep blue but changing. The specific change that happened before dawn actually arrived, and that she'd seen from enough different positions over enough years to know what came after it. "Getting there," she said. Marcus Pruitt was arrested at 6:47 in the morning. He was at his home in a suburb of Denver, a house in a neighborhood with good schools and maintained lawns, and the kind of surface respectability that took a long time to build and came apart very fast under the right circumstances. He answered the door in a robe and had 30 seconds to understand what was happening before the federal arrest team made it unambiguous. Evelyn was not there. She knew about it because Flood called her at 7:15 to tell her, and she received the information standing in the parking lot of a gas station outside Ridgecrest, where she'd stopped to fill the tank of her car, which she'd retrieved from the hospital at some point in the controlled chaos of the previous 12 hours. "He didn't run," Flood said. "He couldn't run. He didn't know it was coming until it was there." She replaced the fuel cap. How did he look? Like someone who'd spent 18 years telling himself the thing he was afraid of couldn't happen. Flood's voice was even. They always looked the same. Who else? Flood went through it. Garrett Lunn, already in federal custody, now facing additional charges that his attorney, Kara Sellers, had spent the night constructing a defense against and would spend the next several years continuing to defend against, without success. Sellers herself was under investigation for the filing she'd made on Lunn's behalf, because the jurisdictional argument she'd used contained information that could only have come from a compromised source, and that source was now identified. One of Flood's 2 CID agents, the one whose access to the day's movements had ended at the Dellwood facility, which was why he hadn't known about Sutter Creek. I was in custody as of 5 in the morning. 3 contractor executives connected to the corporate parent were arrested in 2 states. The corporate entity itself had been frozen by court order at 6 a.m., its assets locked while forensic accountants began the work that Omondi's 14 months of preparation had made possible. The shell company structures that had moved money from military medical supply theft to private accounts across 3 financial systems were now visible in their entirety because Omondi had the originating ledgers and the financial tale in Renner's testimony and 9 years of patience from a woman in a flannel shirt holding a flashlight in a barn. And together those things were enough. Pruitt will cooperate, Flood said. He's already asked about a cooperation agreement. He'll have information about the people above him. That's what we're counting on. A pause. The network doesn't end with him. He was leveraged, like you said. The people who owned him are further up. You'll get there. We'll get there faster with his cooperation and your documentation together. Another pause. Evelyn, your records correction was logged in the old system at 5:42 this morning. It propagated to the current system 30 minutes ago. She said the next sentence carefully, as if she understood its weight. Your name is back. Evelyn stood in the parking lot with the phone against her ear and the morning light coming in from the east over the top of the gas station canopy, pale and direct. The particular light of high altitude after a clear night. Her name. The one she'd been carrying in a different pocket for 9 years. The one she'd answered to inside herself while the world called her by other things. Thank you, she said, and her voice did something at the end of the second word that she didn't try to prevent. There will be formal proceedings, Flood said. Record restoration, commendation review. It's not fast. Bureaucracy is never fast. I know how to wait, Evelyn said. Oh, she went back to the hospital. Not because she was required to. She wasn't. She had no employment there anymore, and the HR review that Sandra had initiated had been overtaken by events of a scale that made it feel like something from a previous geological era. She went back because Renner was there and she hadn't finished what she'd meant to say to him when the man in the white coat had walked through the door and interrupted everything. The floor was different in daylight. Less tense, or differently tense. The particular daytime tension of a hospital operating at capacity rather than the night tension of one holding its breath. There were CID agents still in the corridor outside Renner's room, but they stepped aside when she came up the hallway, and one of them nodded at her with a directness that hadn't been there yesterday, the nod of someone who had received updated information about who she was. She knocked and went in. Renner was sitting up, more upright than yesterday, which was meaningful. It cost him something. She could see that in the line of his jaw, but he was doing it because lying flat was its own kind of vulnerability, and he was done with that. Ranger was on the floor at the foot of the bed, and his head came up when she entered, and his tail moved once in the way of a dog who recognized someone without needing to recalibrate. You look like you've been awake all night, Renner said. I have been awake all night. Did it work? Most of it. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat. Pruitt is in custody. The documentation is in federal hands. Omondi's team is working the financial thread. She looked at him. Your deposition is being unclassified and re-entered into the evidentiary record as of this morning. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the window, to the mountains visible through it, the particular way he looked at them. That was not the tourist look or the aesthetic look, but the look of someone who had been in places that made landscape mean something different. 9 years, he said. Yes. I told myself... He stopped. He looked at his hands, the ones she'd noticed in the trauma bay, the old breaks and the wear. I told myself I must have been wrong, about the deposition, about what I'd found, Because if I was right and nothing happened, that was a different kind of problem. So I just... He stopped again. I decided I was wrong. You weren't wrong, she said. I know that now. He looked at her. Does that make it better or worse? Knowing you were right the whole time and nothing happened anyway? She thought about this honestly, the way the question deserved. Neither, she said. It makes it accurate. Accurate is more useful than better or worse. He looked at her for a moment. Is that how you got through it? That and stubbornness, she said, and keeping the box. Something moved in his face that might, under different circumstances, have become a smile. The box. Don't underestimate the box. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I remember you, from the field station. He said it simply, without the weight of revelation, as if he'd moved past the moment of realizing it and was now just stating what was true. It was dark, and I was down, and you came through the smoke, and I actually thought I was gone. And then there was a woman, and she had her hands on me, and she was talking, very quiet, telling me exactly what she was doing and why, and she didn't stop. He paused. You didn't stop. You were conscious. It helps to talk to someone when they're conscious. It keeps them anchored. You were doing it for my benefit. I was doing it for both of us, she said. It kept me anchored too. He looked at her. The monitors above his head kept their quiet accounting. Ranger made a small sound in his sleep and then was still. The dog, Renner said. You carried the dog. You wouldn't let go of the lead. I was unconscious. Your hand was still holding it. I wasn't going to be the one to open it. She looked at Ranger. He was lighter 9 years ago. This time, the thing in Renner's face completed itself. It was brief, and it cost him something around his ribs, but it was there. Ranger was a puppy. He was not a small puppy. No, he agreed. He never was. She left the hospital at noon. She left through the main entrance, not the side exit she'd used on the first night, and the difference was not lost on her. The choice of door, the direction of the exit, the fact that leaving through the front meant walking past the nursing station where Sandra Kowalczyk was working the day shift and would see her go. Sandra saw her. She put down the chart she was holding. They're saying you were Army, she said. Combat medic. Yes. The airway thing, last night. Sandra looked at her with the expression of someone whose professional assessment was undergoing a significant structural revision. That was field medicine. Field medicine works in emergency departments too, Evelyn said. The principles are the same. Anatomy doesn't change with the context. I know. Sandra was quiet for a moment. I was wrong to pull your assignment. You were doing your job with the information you had, Evelyn said, the same thing she'd said in the corridor yesterday, because it was still true. I was also doing it because you made me uncomfortable, Sandra said. I told you that yesterday. I wanted to say it again, in the light, without a crisis happening around it. She held Evelyn's gaze. That part wasn't my job. That part was just me being wrong. Evelyn looked at her. She thought about everything it took for a person to say something like that, not in the heat of a moment, not under pressure, but in the ordinary light of a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital corridor, with no particular witness and no particular necessity. Just the decision to say the accurate thing. Thank you, Evelyn said. Sandra nodded. She picked up her chart. She went back to work. Evelyn walked out through the main doors into the light. The formal proceedings took 4 months. Not because the evidence was insufficient. The evidence was sufficient, comprehensively and redundantly sufficient, in a way that Omondi described to the Congressional Oversight Committee as the most complete originating change she had encountered in 14 years of financial crimes prosecution. It took 4 months because institutional accountability moved at the speed of institutions, which was the speed of people trying to manage the gap between what they'd allowed to happen and what they were now required to acknowledge had happened. Pruitt cooperated. His cooperation was not graceful. He negotiated for weeks and revised his account twice and tried to characterize his role as peripheral before Omondi put the ledger pages in front of him and showed him his own authorization codes in Evelyn's margin notes. 18-year-old ink on paper that had survived a fire and 9 years in a storage room and 2 men with bolt cutters at 2 a.m, and at that point he stopped negotiating and started talking. What he gave them went up. 3 levels above him in the contractor structure, 2 figures within the DoD oversight apparatus, one former senior official whose name had appeared in government reports for 20 years as a watchdog, and whose actual function had been something categorically different. The arrests came in sequence over 6 weeks, each one generating the kind of coverage that made people say they couldn't believe it, and also revealed, in the way these things always did, that the signs had been there for anyone who'd been positioned to see them and willing to look. Evelyn watched most of this from a distance. She was in Ridgecrest, which was not a place she'd chosen for any particular reason, and turned out to be a reason enough. She knew the terrain, she knew the altitude, she'd learned the sound of its traffic and its weather, and the specific quiet it had at 3 in the morning that was different from the quiet of other places she'd been. Adele Varga called her twice during those 4 months, once to report that Biscuit had caught a rabbit, which was unexpected, and once to ask if Evelyn needed anything, which was the kind of question that simple people asked and complex people rarely knew how to answer. Evelyn said she was fine. She mostly was. Fine was a range, not a point, and she was somewhere inside it. She found a veterinary clinic in Ridgecrest that needed a technician with surgical experience and took the job, which was not the same as being a nurse and was not the same as being a combat medic and was itself, which turned out to be enough. She was good at it. She was good with animals for the same reasons she'd been good with the people in her previous lives. The patience, the precision, the willingness to be in difficult situations without flinching, which animals sense differently than people did but sensed just as clearly. Devereaux brought Ranger in for a follow-up on his shoulder laceration 6 weeks after the hospital, and she dressed the wound and told him the healing was clean, and he said that Ranger had been eating well and sleeping well and showing no behavioral indicators of the kind of stress response that affected working dogs after high-stimulus events. "He's resilient," Evelyn said. "He always has been." Devereaux watched her work on the dog's shoulder. "There's going to be a formal ceremony," he said, "for the record restoration. The commendations review came back last week." She continued what she was doing. "I heard. There's a promotion in there too, retroactive to the date of the original casualty listing." He paused. "They want to do it properly, public, with witnesses." She looked at him. "Why public?" "Because the people who buried it made it private," he said simply. "Because accountability that happens in a room nobody sees isn't really accountability. It's just paperwork." He held her gaze. "And because there are people still serving who knew about the field station and were told it was a training accident, they deserve to know what actually happened." She thought about this. She thought about the 9 years of privacy that she'd maintained not because she wanted it, but because she'd had no other option, and what it meant to have an option now. "All right," she said. The ceremony was on a Thursday morning in October, which was the kind of October morning that Colorado did better than anywhere else. Cold enough for the breath to show, clear enough for the mountains to look like they'd been placed there specifically for this purpose. The aspen already turned, so the hillsides were gold against the granite, and the sky was a color that had no adequate word for it in any language she spoke. There were 40 people there, not a large ceremony. Omondi was there, and Flood and Devereaux, and 3 officers whose names and ranks she'd been told, and was still learning to attach to the faces. Whitfield had come from the hospital, which surprised her, and Sandra Kowalczyk had come, which surprised her more. Adele Varga had driven in from Sutter Creek, which did not surprise her at all. Renner was there. He was standing without support, 6 weeks ahead of the timeline she'd given him, which meant he'd pushed hard on the physical therapy and was paying for it in ways he wasn't showing. He was in uniform. He stood straight. Ranger was there. He sat next to Devereaux and watched everything with the same focused calm he brought to all situations that weren't emergencies. And when Evelyn walked past him to her position, he turned his head and followed her with his eyes, and his tail moved twice. She stood at the front of the room in the uniform they'd provided, the rank that was hers, retroactively and without qualification, the name tape with her actual name on it, and let the words happen over her. Not to her exactly. They were accurate words, finally, words that matched the facts, and that was the thing about accurate words. They didn't require you to do anything with them except let them be true. The commendation was for the field station. The record corrected the casualty listing. The retroactive promotion was confirmed. Her service history, complete and unredacted, was entered into the record as it had actually occurred rather than as it had been edited to appear. When the officer in charge finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Renner took 3 steps forward and saluted her. It was not protocol. It was not part of the ceremony's structure. It was a soldier looking at someone whose name had been erased and making a personal decision to stand in front of everyone present and say, with his body, without words, that he knew what she had done and what it had cost and what it was worth. She returned the salute. Her arm was steady. He said quietly, so that only she could hear, "You came back for me twice." She said, "The mission wasn't finished." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded, and then he stepped back and the room began to move again in the way rooms moved when a held breath was released. Afterward, outside, in the gold. October light, Adele found her. She had a cup of coffee from somewhere, which was very Adele, and she handed it to Evelyn and stood next to her and looked at the mountains. "How does it feel?" she said. Evelyn thought about this the way the question deserved, the same way she'd thought about what Renner had asked her in the hospital. Is it better or worse to know you were right? Because she had learned that the questions other people asked her were almost always the questions she hadn't let herself ask directly, and they deserved real answers. "Strange," she said, "the way it feels when something you've been carrying a long time is set down. You notice the weight more after than during." Adele nodded. "My husband," she said, "carried something for 15 years that he never told me about. A decision he'd made that he thought was wrong. He told me 3 weeks before he died." She looked at her coffee. "I told him it didn't change anything. He said he knew, but that he'd needed to say it to someone while he could." She paused. "I think about that sometimes. The difference between the carrying and the setting down." Evelyn looked at the mountains. The aspens were doing something extraordinary in the light, the gold of them moving slightly in a wind that wasn't strong enough to feel on her face, but was strong enough to move leaves, which was a specific kind of gentle she'd learned to notice in the years she'd spent in this altitude, in this landscape, in this life that had been improvised from necessity and had become, somewhere in the middle of its difficulty, her own. "I think," she said slowly, "the carrying was what it was. I couldn't have set it down earlier. The setting down required everything that happened to make it possible." She paused. "I don't know if that's wisdom or just retrospective justification." "Might be both," Adele said. "Might be," Evelyn agreed. Ranger appeared at her side. She hadn't heard him approach. He moved the way he did everything, with economy and intention. And he stood next to her left leg and looked at the mountains the way she was looking at them, which was probably not what he was actually doing, but was what it looked like. She put her hand on his head. He leaned into it slightly. There was a thing she had learned across the entirety of this, across the 9 years and the ledgers and the fire and the barn and the 47 minutes and everything that came before and after them, and it was this, that the people who erased you counted on you to agree with the erasure. They counted on the weight of institutional authority and official documentation, and the sheer social pressure of everyone around you behaving as though the lie was true to eventually make you behave that way too. They counted on silence, and they cultivated it, and they were patient about it because patience was cheaper than continued action, and because most people, eventually, ran out of the thing that silence required you to spend in order to refuse it. She had not run out of that thing. She didn't entirely know why. She was not extraordinary in ways she could clearly identify. She was stubborn, which was a word that meant almost nothing, and she was precise, and she had kept a box in a storage room in a barn, and she had shown up to work her first night at a hospital and done her job when doing her job cost her something. None of that was heroism in the clean sense that ceremonies made it sound like. It was just refusal, repeated, over time, without an audience. The audience had arrived eventually. That was not the point. The point was the years when there wasn't one. That was the thing worth knowing. Not the ceremony, not the rank tape, not the salute from a man who was standing on bones that were still healing from what she'd done to help keep him alive. Those things were real, and they mattered, and she was not going to pretend they didn't. But the thing worth knowing was the earlier part, that refusing erasure was possible before anyone was watching, in a storage room in a barn in a town called Sutter Creek, in the form of a box that sat on a shelf and waited with more patience than she sometimes had for herself. You didn't carry a thing like that because you knew how it would end. You carried it because setting it down meant agreeing that it didn't matter. She was not willing to agree with that. She had never been willing, and she was less willing now than she had ever been. And she thought that this was probably what people meant when they said that something had made them stronger, although she had always been skeptical of that framing because strength was not the same as survival, and survival was not the same as purpose. And what she had come to understand on this October morning, with the aspens turning gold and a dog leaning against her leg and the mountains doing what mountains did, was that the difference between those things was exactly where you chose to stand. She had chosen. She kept choosing. That was the whole of it, and it was enough, and it would keep being enough for whatever came after this, in whatever shape it arrived. She finished the coffee. She handed the cup back to Adele. "Come see Biscuit sometime," Adele said. "I will," Evelyn said. She looked at the mountains one more time, the gold and the granite and the sky, with no adequate word for it, and then she turned and walked back toward the people, toward the work, toward the rest of it, not as someone returning from somewhere, but as someone who had finally arrived.